author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. On today's special edition, we are talking the Panama Canal. We're talking Nicaragua. We're talking the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and how Donald Trump plans to deal with them all. It's going to be quite the show. And please remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access podcasts, breaking news, analysis, and a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. Hello and welcome to Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're very fortunate to have with us Liberty Nation's national security correspondent and all about fount of knowledge on things international and defense, Mr. Dave Patterson. Thanks for being here, Dave.
Hey, Mark, glad to be with you. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too. And let's talk about this year, what's going to happen. I mean, that's, for me, this is why I really wanted you on the show today, is because there's so much about to come down and land on the world, and some of it's going to be good and some of it's going to be shocking, but all of it in the best possible spirit will hopefully be entertaining for you and I, who make our livings and soothe our souls with international happenings. So Dave, the first one I have to talk about is the situation with the Panama Canal. Now, coincidentally, I'm not referring to Ian Fleming of James Bond fame's coincidentally, it was first time happenstance, second time coincidence, third time enemy action. But we actually, coincidentally, both wrote articles on the Panama Canal and Trump's bid to gain some leverage of control over that. And amazingly, considering, let's be fair, they were both quite lengthy articles, slightly longer than the usual that we have on the page of LibertyNation.com. But we didn't do any crossover at all because there's so many angles to look at this. So, Dave, what's your first blush with Trump's talk about the Panama Canal?
Well, my first blush is that, Trump talks and his words have a lot of different meanings, and he intends them to. And the first blush is, oh my goodness, he's going to go down and take over the Panama Canal. But if you think about it, do you really want the Panama Canal? Do you really want to do this again? It'd be so much of America's treasure in getting this done. But if you want to convince the Panamanians to unload the Chinese at both ends of the canal, then maybe what you're saying will have some impact. So, you always have to look at what Donald Trump means and at not necessarily the specific words that he's using to convey meaning.
Yeah, I'm reminded of, I think it was towards the end of the Art of the Deal, where I'm paraphrasing, I can't remember it exactly, or even close to exact, but it's when you're negotiating, ask for absolutely everything, even if you don't want it. And then, then when you back off, everybody think, oh, thank goodness he only wants this. And that's what you wanted in the first place.
That's right.
You mentioned the Chinese there. And I think this is something that so many people really just aren't taking into account. So the surface level analysis of the Panama Canal situation is that Donald Trump is saying to Panama that, he wants some control, some level of control over something that is now a Panamanian institution as such. But the reality is that, as you say, controlling both ends of the Panama Canal and all of the much of the adjacent land to either side of it, it's all Chinese businesses and Chinese operating companies. And so it's not as though this is Donald Trump making overtures to Panama. This is Donald Trump attempting, as far as I can tell, to take some of the power that China has imposed upon the waterway away and make it a bit of a fairer deal for Americans. Is that Do I have
Yeah,
that
I think
right?
that's right. I think that Donald Trump would never have brought this subject up if the Panama Canal were run by a legitimate Panamanian enterprise, and that the tolls were consistent with other tolls across the world. And no, they're not. They're higher, and the United States does 72% of the business going through the Panama Canal, so it impacts the United States more than any other country in this. And so consequently, it has come up on Donald Trump's scope. And once you do that, you can anticipate that he will work through this until he gets something that looks like what he wants in the beginning.
I mean, there are many ways to approach it, and we'll go into a few of them, I think. But just to get some of the base level data down, as you say, it's 72% of all shipping through the waterway is something to do with the United States. So there's the levies being paid there. And so presumably that means that roughly 72%, obviously there'll be a difference in that there'll be large containers, small containers. But more than 2/3 of the shipping costs, the fees, the levies, are paid by the US. And at the same time, and I think that totals somewhere around, in 2021, it was about just under 3 billion. I'm not sure what that is now, but I'm presuming it's, again, around the 3 billion mark. And then, of course, the State Department notes that America provides Panama with about $3 billion a year anyway, just in taxpayer largesse for something. I'm not entirely sure what America gets out of that deal. But there's $6 billion that is being earmarked, taken by the Panamanians. And to ask for something in return for that doesn't seem overly unreasonable for a commander-in-chief whose primary purpose is, as stated, is America first.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, but remember, this is Donald Trump's theme. The United States, over the years, has become the laughingstock of the rest of the world. We pay for everything, and we get nothing in return. And we have been taken advantage of. But when I say taken advantage of, it's not because we're weak necessarily and they're strong. It's because we have had a State Department that has a philosophy that says, if we're real nice to you, will you be real nice to us? And that's a philosophy for disaster, because they're not going to be real nice to you. They don't care about you. They are interested in what's going on in their country. And they look at us and say, why aren't you thinking about your country? Why do you continually give up things in hopes that we'll be conciliatory, which we never have been?
Well, that's the point, isn't it? There isn't necessarily a reason for these third-party countries to be conciliatory, because they look at the long example that's come out of the State Department. This is going back through various iterations of the State Department, through various leaderships in various parties. And how rare is it that, hey, we did this for you, and you bit the hand that's feeding you? Well, we're not going to continue to do things for you. That just doesn't happen in noticeable enough increments that people think there will be any repercussions for decrying the great Satan, as it were. And
the reason they think that is because there are no repercussions. There are no consequences.
because they're right. Yeah.
Yeah, they're exactly right. I mean, I say this only somewhat facetiously, but you have a State Department that has over the years become a group of people who are stabbing each other in the back while trying to achieve the Alger Hiss chair of fine diplomacy. And you can't take these people seriously. Now, I do understand that there are pockets of intellectual honesty in the State Department. They're hard to find, but nonetheless, they're there. And I believe that you take a Secretary of State like Marco Rubio, he understands that what he's up against, I would hope, and will take the appropriate measures to ensure that if State Department deep state actors want to behave contrary to what the commander-in-chief, the president of the United States, wants to have happen, they will simply be marginalized. And that's how you deal with them. They don't come to your meetings. So if they don't come to your meetings, they don't know what's going on. And if they don't know what's going on, they can't be mischievous.
We're going to continue the conversation on marginalization, but on an international scale after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we continue to be joined by Liberty Nation's national security correspondent, Dave Paston. Now, Dave, we've just been talking about marginalization within the State Department and the potential for that under a Secretary Marco Rubio. And that was in the broader context of what's happening in Panama. Now, I want to kind of continue and put those two threads together because there's actually an alternative to Donald Trump applying pressure diplomatically, and of course an alternative to sending in troops to go down and take the Panama Canal back to American ownership, which of course that's almost certainly not on the table. And that is to invest in the Nicaragua Canal. And this is something that I'm just blown away at how few places across the internet are even talking about the Nicaragua Canal. And it's an idea that was actually floated at the same time as building a Panama Canal in the early 1900s. And it was actually rejected because the Panama route would be much shorter, just 50 miles thereabouts, whereas a canal that runs across Nicaragua would be about 25 miles, a big lake, which is actually quite handy when you think about shipping, especially with the Suez Canal disaster a couple of years ago. And then a further 50 miles to get to the other side, so Pacific to Atlantic. So 75 miles of canal building and a huge lake in the middle, which was harder, much harder back in 1910, 1913, 1914, which would actually be quite an achievable feat nowadays with modern technological abilities. So it seems to me, Dave, and I'm sorry to ramble on about this, it's just shocked me that the only place I've seen this is on the pages of libertynation.com, which everybody should go and read. But it seems to me that Donald Trump's best bet here would be to say I believe it's Daniel Ortega is the Nicaraguan El Presidente, who's basically a social pariah and political pariah. But if he were to say, look, we're going to bring you back into the international fold, we're going to give you some respectability because you're going to oversee one of the biggest, most significant building projects in modern history, and it's going to be a modern wonder. I can just imagine Donald Trump telling the audience that modern wonder. And
huge. It'll be huge.
It's going to be huge. It's bigger than the Panama Canal. Huge. And so that would offer... And of course, the deal would be, of course, that it's American investment and Americans get preferential rates for this kind of stuff. Now, that would be what I think Donald Trump is going to aim at. And what do you make of that? Or am I just whistling in the wind?
I mean, back in the late 1800s, when the French were looking on places to build a canal, Nicaragua was a consideration. And incidentally, they chose Panama principally because it had so much water already in position that geographically digging through land was not going to be as difficult. What they didn't anticipate was that digging through that land also had mosquitoes and malaria and yellow fever, which killed about 22,000 of the French workers. And it just became too difficult. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, in 1904 decided, well, we can do that, and sacrificed only 5,400 American workers as a consequence of yellow fever, but got it done. In 10 years, it was done. But what they did not anticipate, which would be in favor of the Nicaraguan project, is that they did not anticipate mega tankers and mega cargo ships, which do not fit in the Panama Canal, even though they have widened it in some areas. So this would be a reason for Nicaragua to think cordially about such an idea. And of course, the United States could make it, as they say, an offer they can't refuse. But again, you're looking at a communist nation, a nation aligned with China and Russia. And so to have them suddenly become a benefactor of the United States idea might be a stretch, but if anybody could do that and bring them around, it would be Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, that Donald Trump's never really been afraid to reach out to those who are on the outskirts of the, let's call it the Overton window of acceptability in international politics.
Yeah.
I mean, he did the Kim Jong-un meetup, which was, I mean, I still rate that as one of the most historic events of the last century, that they actually crossed the demilitarized zone, and Donald Trump made fat jokes, which was kind of fun. So that was hilarious.
Yeah, I know, and who took them in the spirit in which they were given, laughed, and the thing that I do think is it is an important aspect which might come down in favor of the Nicaraguan idea is that Ortega has been there as the president since Reagan.
Yeah.
So he's had staying power, but with staying power comes age, and you start to get stale, and he may not be there all that much longer. Yeah. And so he might be open to a legacy that, given the credit, you provided a world wonder that benefits the world, and you get the credit. So he might be open for that.
Yeah, I think so. With Daniel Ortega, that there's recently been some more constitutional amendments that coincidentally favor Daniel Ortega. Surprise, surprise. But I think that he's really pushed things as far as he can go in that more authoritarian bent. And now he needs to, for his own legacy, as you say, he needs to wind things back a little and say, right, this is what I'm leaving behind. This is what's going to secure his family's positions in the future. And that will be, I suspect that'll be something that he's got his eyes on at the moment. So to round out there, just how serious do you think Trump is in this intention that everybody seems to think is to take over the Panama Canal?
I think you have to think about it in what is his objective, and his objective is to have unfettered access to the Panama Canal without fear of Chinese intervention on either side. That's his objective, and if that can be done short of sending troops to Panama, he'd be all for it.
Yep, I think that's pretty much rounded that one off. Dave, thanks very much. We'll be back with Dave Patterson after this short break, where we're going to delve into the UN, the WHO, and its future with Donald Trump at the helm of the White House. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And you're back on Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. We're continuing our conversation with Liberty Nation national security correspondent, Dave Patterson. Now, Dave, earlier we covered the Panama Canal situation, which is just a fascinating story of one-upmanship and geostrategic politics. It blows me away. But there is that geo element, as in that worldwide element. And so we've got Donald Trump hurtling towards the White House, becoming president again on January 20th this year. And he has made some very bold statements regarding the U.S. membership of international organizations. And I'm thinking here the UN, the WHO. What's the deal?
Well, I think he recognizes that the United Nations tends to favor all of the underdeveloped nations who contribute very little to the total welfare of the globe, and so that catering to those nations puts countries like the United States, Great Britain, France, the Western nations, the first world nations, at a disadvantage. So, in other words, you're disadvantaging the very nations that can provide the real solutions to the problems that third world nations have, and yet they're the ones who pay the bills and are listened to least.
Yeah, I can actually, to some degree, I can see these third party nations, these non-Western developed nations point, as in, well, we don't want a top down answer to things, but because they've got their own national pride, which of course every country should have, and they want to be solving the problems for themselves. But if the solution to that problem comes from either the expertise or, let's be clear, the cash outlay from another country, then you've got to pay the piper. And it does seem that how they could repay the piper for the solutions that are being provided through the U.S. taxpayer largesse, and obviously the U.K. taxpayer largesse, is they could perhaps support the UK and the US in various congresses that they create within the UN and WHO. And I was the reason I really wanted to discuss this subject was because I found a fantastic speech that I think everybody is probably familiar with, but it's a Time for Choosing speech by Ronald Reagan. He called it the speech, by the way, the speech, and that he was this was 63 or 64, I think 64, and he was rallying for Barry Goldwater. And I copied and pasted the quote, and it's fantastic. But he says, quote, "I think we're for an international organization where the nations of the world can seek peace. But I think we're against subordinating American interests to an organization that has become so structurally unsound that today you can muster a 2/3 vote on the floor of the General Assembly among nations that represent less than 10% of the world's population. I think we're against the hypocrisy of assailing our allies because here and there they cling to a colony, while we engage in a conspiracy of silence and never open our mouths about the millions of people enslaved in the Soviet colonies in the satellite nations." Now, if we remove the word Soviet colonies there, I think that would apply just as well today, don't you, Dave?
Absolutely. 60 years later, Reagan has simply said truth, and truth tends to last the test of time. And I think too that what has happened to us most recently is, and I tend to be tough on third world nations because they tend to not represent the kind of discipline and structure that Western nations tend to tout. But at the same time, I have to tell you that the current administration and their willingness to foist woke ideologies on these people who actually do know the difference between men and women and have known for quite some time, and they take great offense at this. And so why should they listen to a United States who pushes stuff that they know is absolutely not true? So you have this dynamic working, these two things working at the same time. They have their own views of the world, which they push and want to have recognized as being legitimate. At the same time, they have a country like the United States who says, "Oh, by the way, we'll help you if you take on this notion that men are men and women are women and women can become men and men can become women." They think we're crazy, and of course they're true. They're right. That is crazy, but that's another aspect of the fact that we live in a time when we can't just go and make a single diagnosis with a single symptom, because that isn't the way it is.
It's strange that for decades now we've been thought of the evils of expansionism and colonialism, and yet there's this ideological colonialism taking place. It's this imposition of values and mores that come from, and let's be fair, these are not values that are held or shared by the vast majority of Americans, and yet they're being exported as a cultural imposition. And it's almost the same people who decry that Christianity was brought by the point of the sword are now reveling that a new ideology is being brought with essentially accept what we say as the gospel, or you don't get the money and you might die. And it's really, I don't really see the moral difference between the two.
Well, the reason you don't see it is because there is no moral difference between the two. And so what you end up having, and it's one of the reasons I think that, well, perhaps the principal reason that Donald Trump has little respect for the UN, WHO, those kinds of organizations, is that the very behavior that the United States prompts amongst the third world is the very behavior that they exhibit in WHO and the UN generally that causes Donald Trump to have less respect for them. But there are some organizations in the UN that absolutely deserve for the United States to withdraw its support. WHO is absolutely one of them. I mean, honestly, can you imagine WHO comes to consensus on a way to treat, now, the word consensus is the operative word, the way to treat a particularly dangerous pathogen, and the United States should just fall in line, as should England or all of the rest of the world. Well, oh yeah, great. Whatever you say, Burkina Faso, we're right along with you.
It's a dangerous form of science, isn't it? Science by consensus. This is the thing that's always bugged me about Barack Obama's very misguided statement about 93% of climate scientists agree, because it was never quite clear when that became the totem of what is it precisely that they agree on, to what extent do they agree. And now, as you say, under the new burgeoning rules of the World Health Organization, that there is a consensus approach to science, and that if there were a consensus approach to science, we wouldn't be cooking with fire.
That's right. That's exactly right. And nobody. What do you mean, rub two sticks together? No, we're not good.
Fire's dangerous. We've seen fire burn things. Let's go there. The majority agree. That's now what you're doing. That's your whole process. This is how you're going to save lives if there's a new deadly pathogen. We're going to continue this conversation, hopefully with less references to cavemen. After this short break, don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back on Liberty Nation Radio. I remain your host, Mark Angelides, and we continue our conversation with Dave Patterson. Now, we were just talking, Dave, about the World Health Organization and the rules of consensus that under the new framework will actually govern what the United States can and can't do, should and shouldn't do. Now, how serious is Donald Trump about cutting the umbilical cord to these organizations when he resumes?
I think he's very serious. Why should we pay for ideas, for procedures, for things that we do not agree with, that are inimical to what we stand for? Why should we pay for that? And it seems like a pretty sound logic, And so consequently, we will not, under Donald Trump, I believe, fall in line with the Bidens, the Blinkens, the other Bs, whatever, pick your favorite, in saying to the United Nations, oh, sure, whatever you guys come up with, we're right there with you, because we won't be. And it's really a deception for the United States to give the impression that we would be, because we won't. Washington is an influential city, but it's one city in a vast country. And not everybody was ever in lockstep with anything the Biden administration did.
So that's an interesting way to look at it. It's a very Washington, D.C. based approach to where America's place is in the international order. And I think it was Churchill who said, if we choose between the mainland and the sea, we must always choose the sea, because he didn't want so much to be involved in what was set to become the European Union as such. And there's I think when the Brexit vote won in 2016, I think one of the main reasons for that, and it was certainly my reason for supporting the movement, was that it was about national sovereignty, that a country should always be able to make its own decisions that best suit its own people, because there's a direct democracy involvement there. As in, if you're part of an international organization, then the decisions are made by people that you can't vote out of office. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's the great unwashed bureaucracy that simply sits in their cubicles thinking up stuff that is maybe or maybe not beneficial to the rest of the society. But nonetheless, they have this power of the pen, literally, or the computer in this case, where they think up regulations, and there is absolutely no limits on what they do.
For example, if an American public become incredibly disheartened by Antonio Guterres, or I think the new gentleman at the top of the UN is Mark Rutte, the former Dutch prime minister. If the American people don't like what he's doing, and let's say 100% of the American people, there's no dissenters here, all decide this is bad, they can't get rid of him. That's the reality, because the US only has a small vote compared to the other. So I get that the whole purpose of the UN is that it's operating for the greater good of everybody, but that's not America first, and therefore the individuals suffer for the rise of, and possibly a foolhardy benefit to the international organization itself, and it really cuts out what is at the heart of the American project, which is independence.
So the one thing that establishes and fortifies the America First and its independence is its economy, and the fact that if we don't like it and it becomes so abhorrent to us, we'll stop paying for it. And when the United States stops paying for things, even China can't take up the slack.
It's a risk that they should be aware of, but under recent administrations, not just Democrat administrations either, I should point out, but Republicans alike, there has been a willingness to just go along to get along. And now, what would this look like? What do you think that Donald Trump's going to do to extricate the United States from these things? What are these steps that he can and will or may take?
Well, he just simply says we're no longer a member of the WHO. We're no longer a member of, pick your favorite.
So a unilateral withdrawal is it easy?
It's that easy. We're not bound by treaty to UN organizations because they come and go. But the United States is bound by what it says it will pay for. And we have been, I think, pretty diligent about saying that we'll pay for something, and we do. But at the same time, we can also say we are not going to underwrite WHO. And then simply not do it.
That's an interesting point. So let's say, for example, Donald Trump.
Donald Trump, incidentally, has done this before.
Yeah.
So it's not a new concept.
Yeah. Very true. Yeah. There's also the international accords that he's withdrawn from as well, like the Paris Climate Agreement. Which, sorry, just a side note. What a joke the Paris Climate Accords were. That the only obligation that each member had was to put a statement out that they were planning to reduce their carbon emissions by a certain amount within a certain amount of time. And there are no teeth to it. So they put the statement out and say, well, in 10 years, we'll have reduced this much. And if they don't do it in 10 years, well, it doesn't make any difference. All you've got to do is continue putting out a statement. It's a boondoggle of the highest order.
The only aspect, I mean, not the only, but one of the major aspects of that particular Paris Climate Agreement that wasn't a joke was for the American taxpayers who shelled out billions and billions, hundreds of billions of dollars in order to make the scam work.
Well, yeah, it always takes taxpayer dollars, Dave. Otherwise, there's no point. If there were no taxpayer dollars, there wouldn't be a point in putting the whole thing together. So,
but see, doesn't that statement that you made, doesn't that reinforce the fact that Trump is right about the United Nations? And we need to pick and choose very carefully who we support within that organization and make the criteria for our support. Does it, in fact, support the desires of the United States in the world? We get it. We're in the world. We're not isolated, but we do have needs and aspirations. And does our support in the United Nations fortify those needs and aspirations in an America First approach to things? Or are we simply the lackeys of the majority consensus of the United Nations?
Yeah, I see what you're saying there, Dave. There's something that I want to address, and that is the chief criticism of Trump's critics. The chief critics criticize of what he's proposing to do. And they say that, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, that if we come out of the World Health Organization, how will we manage, what will we do? We'll be cut off from everybody else. And I think, well, don't we have these national institutes of health? Don't we have all these things? What was Dr. Fauci doing for the last 800 years in office? Don't we have organizations, the CDC, that specifically do these things that would be the necessary things that we'd need in case of, for example, a pathogen, a new illness, that kind of stuff? Doesn't the US and the UK, don't we have these organizations already in place? And aren't they technically far better than the World Health Organization anyway? And so the World Health Organization is really only about policy rather than a direct action to prevent the spread of disease. Or have I got that wrong?
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that. I mean, they do have agencies and tentacles that go out and attempt to make sure that drinking water is safe and so forth, and to identify the beginnings of disease spread. And but at the same time, bilateral agreements between Great Britain and these countries, the United States and these countries, are far more effective in dealing with specific problems than with this amalgam of consensus spewing faux scientists that exist in the WHO. I mean, let's face it. I mean, the United Nations has not done itself proud in recent years, having their organization in Gaza Strip that actually aided and abetted and supported the Hamas terrorists on October 7th when they invaded Israel, and numerous other examples where the United Nations has worked actively against the best interests of the rest of the world. So it's not like Donald Trump came up with these ideas without any evidence to support it.
We'll see what he brings with him in 2025. Dave Patterson, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you, Mark. Always a pleasure to be with you. Look forward to the new year.
And that's all we have time for on this first edition of Liberty Nation Radio of 2025. I'd like to thank our guest, Dave Patterson, for joining us. And of course, thank you, the listeners, for being here in the new year. I do wish you a very, very happy new year. And please remember, Liberty Nation does not endorse candidates, campaigns, or legislation. And this presentation is no endorsement. Thanks for being here.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.